Dean Martin opened the door and walked toward the stage, cigarette in his hand, tuxedo spotless, and Jerry Lewis froze at the microphone because the man he hadn't spoken to in 20 years was now 5 meters away, and Dean's face showed nothing. Wait, because what Dean had told Frank Sinatra 30 minutes before he started that walk almost stopped him from leaving the room at all, and nobody understood what it cost him. Ed McMahon's dressing room smelled like hairspray, and old carpet, and something Dean couldn't quite place. Maybe nerves, maybe history, maybe just the particular staleness of backstage air in Las Vegas in September. Dean sat in a metal folding chair, knees apart, elbows on his thighs, cigarette burning between 2 fingers. He'd been sitting there for 40 minutes. The chair was uncomfortable, the kind that makes you shift your weight every 30 seconds. But Dean hadn't moved, not once. Outside the door, the MDA Labor Day telethon was happening, phones ringing in waves, Jerry working the crowd with that manic energy. The voice Dean had heard in 1,000 nightclubs, on 100 radio shows, in 16 movies. The voice he hadn't heard in person in 20 years. His stomach hurt, not sharp pain, just a low, constant pressure. Dean took a drag, held it, let it out slow through his nose. Frank Sinatra stood by the door, watching Dean like he was watching a horse that might bolt. Frank had his tuxedo on, perfectly pressed, bow tie already tied. "You don't have to do this," Frank said. His voice was quiet, almost gentle. Dean didn't look up. He took another long drag, felt it burn, let it out slow. "I know," he said. 2 words. Flat. Final. Frank didn't push. If you knew Dean Martin, really knew him, you knew pushing didn't work. Dean was like water. You couldn't force him. Frank just stood there and waited. Dean stared at the floor. The linoleum had a pattern, speckled gray and white. He focused on that pattern, focused on anything except the fact that in a few minutes he was going to walk out and face a man he'd walked away from in 1956 and hadn't looked back. Except that wasn't quite true. He had looked back. Not publicly, not in interviews, but alone, late at night, when the house was quiet and the golf trophies caught the moonlight. Yeah, he'd looked back. He'd thought about Jerry, about the 10 years they'd spent making people laugh, about the way they'd fit together. Dean smooth against Jerry's manic. It had worked. God, it had worked. Until it didn't. Here's what most people didn't know about Dean Martin. He hated surprises, the drunk persona, the loose improvisation, the casual swagger. All of it was controlled, rehearsed. Dean knew exactly what he was going to say before he said it. Control was everything. And this, walking onto a stage in front of 85 million people with no script, no plan, no idea what would happen. This was the opposite of control. This was free-falling. Frank had pitched the idea 2 weeks earlier over drinks at the Sands. "Jerry's doing the telethon. You should come. Show up. Don't tell him. Let me handle it." Dean had said no. Immediate no. Frank had smiled. "Think about it." Dean said no again. But something shifted. Dean couldn't stop thinking about it. He'd be lining up a putt and suddenly see Jerry's face. He'd be at dinner and not hear a word because he was thinking about the Copacabana in 1956. So Dean had called Frank back. "If I do this, I'm not making a speech. I'm not crying. I'm not doing a whole thing." Frank said, "You don't have to. And if Jerry doesn't want me there, I walk." Fair. Now Dean was sitting in this dressing room, wondering what the hell he'd been thinking. Frank leaned against the doorframe. "What do I say to him?" Dean asked. The question came out quiet, almost a whisper. Frank thought about it. "You'll know." Dean shook his head. "I won't. I never knew what to say to him. That was the problem. Then don't say anything. Just stand there. Let him talk. Jerry always talks." Dean laughed, short, dry, no humor in it. "Yeah, he does." The laugh died fast. What if he's still mad? Frank sat down in the other chair. Their knees were almost touching. Then he's mad. But you'll know you tried. Dean took a drag. I don't think I can do this. Frank didn't react, just sat there, letting Dean work through it. You know what Jerry told me once, Frank said. He said the thing he missed most wasn't the act. He said it was you laughing at his stuff backstage. He said you had the best laugh. Real laugh. The one he could trust. Dean's throat tightened. That was a long time ago. Doesn't have to be, Frank said quietly. Outside, the crowd was chanting something. Dean could feel it in his chest. All those people. All those cameras. All those expectations. Let me take you back for a second, because you need to understand what 20 years meant, not just the number. The weight. July 25th, 1956. The Copacabana in New York. Martin and Lewis, the biggest comedy team in the world, walked off stage after their final show. 10 years to the day since they'd started. They didn't hug. They didn't shake hands. Dean went to his dressing room. Jerry went to his separate cars, separate lives. The split made headlines within hours. What people didn't talk about was the quieter stuff. Dean felt like the straight man in his own life. Magazine covers had Jerry front and center, Dean off to the side. Interviewers asked Jerry about his process, asked Dean what it was like working with Jerry. Film directors called it a Jerry Lewis picture. Small things, the kind that shouldn't matter but do when they happen every single day for 10 years. Dean didn't complain. Complaining wasn't his style. He just started showing up late, missing rehearsals, playing more golf. When Paramount offered them a new contract, Jerry signed immediately. Dean looked at the paper for a long time. I'm not signing, he said. Jerry thought he was joking. I'm done, Dean said. That was it. No big fight. Just I'm done. And 20 years of silence. Stop for a second and picture the room from above. Dean in the dressing room, cigarette burning down, hands starting to shake just enough that he had to grip his knees to keep them still. Frank by the door, watching with those blue eyes that had seen everything. And 15 feet away, Jerry Lewis at a microphone on live television, totally unaware that his entire night was about to change. Frank's plan was surgical. He'd walk out, perform one song, then walk over to Jerry, chat for a minute, and say the words, I have a friend who loves what you do every year. 6 words. And Dean would walk out. Clean, simple, devastating. Dean stubbed out the cigarette. The ashtray was already full. He lit another one. I walked away from him once. What if I walk out there and realize I should have stayed away? Frank stood up. Then you walk away again, but at least you'll know. He checked his watch. I'm on in 3. Dean nodded, didn't move. Frank walked to the door, turned back. You know what the difference is between you and Jerry? He wears his heart on his sleeve. You keep yours locked up tight. Maybe tonight it's okay to let it show a little. And then Frank walked out. Listen carefully to what happened next, because this is where the countdown started. Dean had maybe 4 minutes before Frank would finish his song. 4 minutes to decide. 4 minutes to figure out what 20 years of silence was worth. He stood up, walked to the mirror, fixed his collar, even though it didn't need fixing, took one last drag, and crushed it. Outside, Frank Sinatra walked onto the stage. The crowd went wild. Frank performing live for the first time in 23 years. Jerry came over, beaming, thanked him. Frank smiled that Sinatra smile, the one that said he knew something you didn't. He sang Never Gonna Fall in Love Again. Dean heard every word through the wall, counted the verses, each one bringing him closer. The song ended. Applause crashed. Now. It was happening now. Frank's voice. Jerry, come here for a second. Jerry's laugh. What are you up to, Frank? Frank's voice dropped. You know there's someone who's been watching too. Someone who loves what you do every year. And Frank turned toward the wings. Dean? Dean's hand was on the doorknob. His palm was sweating. He could still say no, but Dean opened the door. The hallway was bright. He could see the stage, could see Jerry, could see the audience, all waiting. Dean walked. Each step felt like it took an hour. Left foot, right foot. The cigarette was still in his hand. The audience saw him first. The gasp started small, then exploded. Dean kept walking. Then he was on stage. The lights hit him full force. White. Blinding. The audience was a blur. The cameras were there. 85 million people watching. Jerry didn't move, just stood there, frozen, mouth open, eyes wide. Pure shock. Dean walked slowly. His eyes locked on Jerry. Jerry's eyes locked on him. The audience was screaming, but Dean couldn't hear it. All he could hear was his own heartbeat and his own breathing. He didn't smile, couldn't smile. He kept his eyes on Jerry, because if he looked away, he'd lose his nerve. When Dean reached the microphone, he stopped, 2 feet from Jerry, close enough to see every line on Jerry's face, close enough to see the tears forming. They stood there, neither one moving. Then Jerry stepped forward, arms out, and Dean Martin put his arms around Jerry Lewis and held on. Not a quick hug, a real one, the kind you give someone you thought you'd lost forever. Dean could feel Jerry shaking, or maybe Dean was shaking. Jerry's hands gripped Dean's back. Dean's throat was so tight he couldn't swallow. His eyes were burning. The audience lost it, screaming, camera flashes, phones lighting up. Dean pulled back, had to. If he stayed one more second, he'd lose it. He stepped back, put one hand on Jerry's shoulder. Jerry's face was wet, tears streaming. He tried to talk. Nothing came out. Tried again. His voice cracked. The audience laughed. Gentle laughter, loving laughter. Jerry wiped his eyes, looked at Dean, and then he said it. The same thing he'd said in 1946. "So, you workin'?" The place erupted. Dean felt something release in his chest. He smiled, real smile. "Yeah." At the Megam, the MGM Grand, Jerry laughed. That big, loud Jerry Lewis laugh Dean remembered from 1,000 backstage moments. The audience ate it up. They talked for maybe 2 minutes. Short sentences. Inside jokes. Jerry mentioned the old act. "Remember Atlantic City? With the dishes?" Dean remembered. "You broke 6 plates. You were supposed to catch them." The audience laughed, even though they didn't know the story. They could feel it, the history, the connection. Dean didn't stay long. This was Jerry's show. After a few minutes, he patted Jerry's shoulder. "Keep doing what you're doing." Jerry nodded, couldn't speak. Dean gave a small wave and walked off, in and out, clean. But here's what nobody saw. When Dean got back to the dressing room, he sat down in that same chair and put his face in his hands, not crying. Dean Martin didn't cry, but processing. 20 years of silence and 2 minutes of stage time. His hands were still sweating. He reached for a cigarette. The pack was empty. Frank came in maybe 10 minutes later. Didn't knock. Just walked in. Sat down in the other chair. They sat in silence. Could have been 5 minutes. Could have been 20. Finally, Dean looked up. His eyes were red but dry. "Thanks," he said. One word, but it carried everything. Frank nodded. "Anytime, Pally." Another long silence. Then Frank said, "You okay?" Dean thought about it. Really thought about it. "Yeah," he said. And for the first time all night, he meant it. The phones at the telethon exploded. That year became one of the highest grossing in MDA history. $29 million. A record. The reunion made every major newspaper. Front page. Entertainment Tonight. The Evening News. Walter Cronkite called it a moment of grace in an increasingly cynical world. Jerry called 2 days later. Dean almost didn't answer. When Jerry picked up, neither of them knew what to say. "Hey," Dean said. "Hey," Jerry said back. Long pause. Then Jerry laughed. "This is weird, right?" "Yeah, it's weird." But they talked for 45 minutes about nothing important: golf, Vegas, the weather, safe topics, the kind you talk about when you're rebuilding a bridge one plank at a time. And then they kept calling. Every few days at first, then every few weeks. Sometimes Dean would call Jerry. Sometimes Jerry would call Dean. They never performed together again, but they stayed in touch, and that mattered. In 1987, Dean's son Dean Paul Jr. died in a plane crash. Air National Guard F-4 Phantom. Dean got the news on a Tuesday. A chaplain came to the door. Dean knew before the man opened his mouth. The funeral was 3 days later. Dean barely remembered it. The church, the flowers, the people, all of it blurred together in grief, so thick he could barely breathe. Jerry showed up. Didn't call first. Just showed up, sat in the back where nobody would see him. After the service, Jerry walked up to where Dean was standing, alone, staring at the coffin. "Dean," Jerry said quietly. Dean turned, nodded. Couldn't speak. Jerry didn't hug him, didn't offer platitudes, just stood there. And after a minute, Dean said, "He was a good kid." His voice cracked. "I didn't tell him enough." Jerry nodded. He knew. Kids always know. Dean's eyes filled. "I should have told him more." "Yeah." But he knew. They stood there for 5 minutes. Then Jerry said, "You need anything, you call me." Middle of the night. "Doesn't matter." And Jerry left. Quiet exit. Same as Dean had done at the telethon. After that, Dean and Jerry talked more often. Real conversations. About loss. About regret. Dean told Jerry things he'd never told anyone. About feeling trapped. About wanting to be taken seriously. Jerry told Dean about feeling abandoned. They didn't solve everything. Some wounds are too old to fully heal. But they understood each other better. And understanding was enough. When people asked Dean about the reunion, he always said, "Frank set it up. I just showed up." Simple. Dismissive. The Dean Martin way. But that answer was incomplete. Because showing up wasn't just showing up. It was facing 20 years of silence. It was walking onto a stage with no script and no safety net. It was letting himself be vulnerable in a way he'd spent a lifetime avoiding. That took courage. Real courage. The quiet kind nobody applauds because nobody knows it's happening. If you enjoyed spending this time here, I'd be grateful if you'd consider subscribing. A simple like also helps more than you'd think. Frank Sinatra understood people in a way most people didn't. He understood that some wounds need healing, and some distances need closing, and sometimes all it takes is putting two people in the same room and reminding them who they used to be. He gave Dean and Jerry that gift, not the reunion itself. That was just logistics. The gift was the push, the permission, the belief that it was worth trying even after 20 years of silence. And Dean took it, took the gift, took the chance. Not perfectly, not completely, not the way Jerry would have done it, with tears and big dramatic gestures. Dean did it his way. Quiet, reserved. A walk onto a stage, a hug, a few words, a walk off. But underneath all that control, there was something real, something that mattered. Dean Martin died on Christmas Day, 1995, 78 years old. Jerry Lewis was one of the people he'd called in those final months. Not every day, not for long conversations, but enough, just to hear the voice, just to know that whatever else happened, they'd fixed it. The thing between them, the thing that had broken in 1956 and stayed broken for 20 years until Frank Sinatra and a Las Vegas telethon put it back together. September 5th, 1976, the Sahara Hotel, Las Vegas, Nevada. Dean Martin walked out of a dressing room and onto a stage and changed his life. Not because of what he said, not because of the cameras or the audience, but because he chose to walk forward instead of away, because he chose connection over pride, because Frank pushed, and Dean listened, and Jerry forgave, and for 2 minutes on live television, 20 years of silence turned into something better. Some moments change everything. This was one of them, not just for Dean and Jerry, for everyone watching, for everyone who'd ever walked away from someone they loved and wondered if it was too late to walk back. That night, Dean Martin proved it's never too late. Not if you're willing to take the first step, not if you're willing to show up. And Dean Martin always knew how to make an entrance.